Steve and I have both been at CrowdStrike for about the same amount of time, about 3 years. And when I was thinking about, how we would frame this presentation, and what I really started to think about was even how, in the last 3 years, how the way adversaries carry out identity-based attacks has changed, right? So if I just go back to what we were talking about 3 years ago, hit the clicker, what? Oh, there you go. There we go. Okay, so this was a very typical attack chain 3 years ago, right? So we saw adversaries start to use access brokers more and more effectively to get credentials when they turn up at the front door to carry out their attack, right? And then they would be exploiting, vulnerabilities as a way to get that initial network access. And then from there, they would gain access to your environment, move laterally, and then it was game over, right? So from an identity protection point of view, what we talked about 3 years ago, and obviously what we're still talking about today, we're not saying that this has stopped, right? But particularly what we talked about a few years ago was having real-time protection, real-time enforcement on the domain controller to block suspicious things. So for example, if we saw an account that had a compromised password, logging on from a machine that was outside of the behavioral baseline, maybe we would block that or challenge for MFA, right? And the fundamental thing here was this is when we started to hear more and more about how malware-less attacks were getting more and more popular, right? So back in 2021, the Global Threat Report said it was 62% malware-less attacks, right? Where it was adversaries using valid credentials and then living off the land.
And 2021, it seems so long ago now, and those old risks are still present today. The reality is, though, that as soon as an adversary has a foothold, their next target are your identities, making identity security the first initial line of attack. Returning to the present now, the biggest risk to organisations is the rise in phishing, credential theft, and associated MFA bypass. After obtaining initial access, instead of targeting on-premise infrastructure, we've seen those attacks pivot to the cloud, allowing adversaries to exploit that trust relationship in hybrid environments. We've tracked this change in our Global Threat Report, where we're now seeing over 75% of attacks are actually malware-free. Compromised credentials without phish-resistant MFA is opening the front door to the adversary. Phishing attacks are at an all-time high, with man-in-the-middle frameworks like EvilJinx freely available. They have never been easier to execute. Widespread info-stealer campaigns are being run to harvest credentials and target organisations of interest. Adversaries are exploiting the lack of phish-resistant MFA to lure users to fake pages, capture their credentials and associated session cookies, and then register their own MFA tokens to establish persistence. Falcon Identity Protection has always been able to detect and respond to these type of attacks after the fact. But our teams have been hard at work to understand how we can actually take these real-time enforcement actions in cloud environments too. So as the adversary evolves and changes tactics, our architecture does too. Our principle remains the same. By combining first and third-party risk signals in the platform with real-time authentication, we proactively prevent identity-based attacks. For on-premise Active Directory, this is easy. With Falcon Identity Protection, we're in line on the authentication and able to detect, log, or block or MFA. This includes response actions to quarantine the host, regardless of whether we have a sensor on the endpoint or not. We can take additional response actions to third parties and cloud providers, such as killing the Entra sessions being used by the adversary. Now, there's one piece to this puzzle that we're really looking forward to adding, and we're going to chat to you about further today.
So that sounds easy, right? Just sit directly in the path of authentication events, and then you can stop bad stuff from happening, right? Now, as you saw, some amazing announcements with more collaboration that we have with Microsoft. And by the way, I've worked with Microsoft for about 4 months on this integration from the moment that they released the beta and the preview, right? So there's been amazing collaboration there. But, we're not going to install a Falcon sensor somewhere within Entra ID, right? That just doesn't make any sense, right? And it's the same with other identity providers as well. You know, Okta, OneLogin, right? If we want to be able to intercept those authentication requests, block MFA, the question is how. So when we talk about the evolution of the architecture, this is where we're introducing support for OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is a very common identity standard that effectively means we can plug and play with any identity provider that supports that standard. So what it means is, rather than having to build specific integrations for specific identity providers, the question is, do you support OIDC? If the answer is yes, then we can plug and play and do all the stuff that we've just spoken about before. So what we're talking about today is we're announcing our integration with Microsoft. So this is basically an OpenID Connect integration with Microsoft Entra ID. And in the future, we're going to add support for other identity providers as well.